Hello, everyone. Welcome back to In Scripture, our look at the Gospel according to Mark. I'm Father Joshua Whitfield at St. Rita Catholic Community in Dallas, Texas. We are still in chapter 1 of Mark's Gospel. We will finish chapter 1 in this session as we look at verses 35 through 45. But before we begin, as we always begin, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. O God, early in the morning I cry to you. Help me to pray and to concentrate my thoughts on you. I cannot do this alone. In me there is darkness, but with you there is light. I am lonely, but you do not leave me. I am feeble in heart, but with you there is help. I am restless, but with you there is peace. In me there is bitterness, but with you there is patience. I do not understand your ways, but you know the way for me. Restore me to liberty and enable me so to live now that I may answer before you and before me. Lord, whatever this day may bring, your name be praised. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's a beautiful prayer by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great Lutheran pastor killed by the Nazis. He wrote this prayer while he was in prison. And it's a beautiful word to offer the Lord as we look at this section of Mark's Gospel and the story of Jesus cleansing the leper. The leper comes to him and prays and begs the Lord, if you will, please clean me. It's a beautiful prayer. Before we dive in the text, let's read the text. And so beginning in verse 35. And in the morning, a great while before day, he rose and went out to a lonely place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him followed him, and they found him and said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." And he said to them, "Let us go to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. And a leper came to him, begging him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And he sternly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, for a proof to the people." But he went out and began to talk freely about it, and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter. This section of Mark's Gospel, the last 10 verses of chapter 1, marks the second day of Jesus' public ministry. By way of recap, you'll remember after Jesus called his first four disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John, they went into the synagogue at Capernaum and exorcised a demon from a man, and then Jesus healed Simon's mother-in-law, and that was the first day, right? And as Mark said in verse 33 of chapter 1, these events caused a stir, and Jesus' fame grew quickly throughout all of Galilee. He started his ministry off with a bang. And here in day 2, Jesus goes off to pray in a deserted place and then heals a leper while strangely transgressing ritual law and at the same time respecting it, as we'll see. So just to dive in, verse 35, in the morning, a great while before the day, that is before dawn, right? Jesus is an early riser on this day, and it says he rose and went out to a lonely place, and there he prayed. Before I dive into that, just to say, especially in this passage, I was struck, these 10 verses, I was struck by, the verbs. One of the ways to read the scriptures fruitfully and meditatively, to invent a word, a great way to read the scriptures as meditation is to follow the verbs, right? It just paints a very vivid picture. And so the verbs here in verse 35 at least tell me a great deal. He rose, he went out and prayed, right? Rose, went out and prayed. What's beautiful is that we see that after Jesus' first day of public ministry, he gets up in the morning and he intentionally seeks out solitude, right? He intentionally schedules prayer time for himself, devotion time, quiet time, a retreat for himself. He goes to literally a deserted place, a desert place, right? Which of course evokes, all the biblical, has all the biblical connotations of the desert, right? The desert is a place of clarity, of purification, of renewal, right? And of crisis. And so here's Jesus after his first day going out to the desert, to a deserted place, and praying, right? We'll see Jesus pray several times throughout the gospel. He'll exhort his own disciples to pray. And of course, as a good Jew, that's what good Jews did. They prayed early in the morning. We know from the Psalms they prayed at set times of the day. We see Peter and John praying at set times in Acts of the Apostles. So we get the picture of Jesus, not just, and again, what's amazing, what's remarkable is that as we see, Mark is such a fast-paced gospel, yet even though it's a gospel full of action and it's a gospel of speed, that doesn't mean there aren't moments of quiet and prayer and solitude and reflection, right? And so just this image of Jesus getting up before the sun does and finding a place and carving out time for himself for prayer is the very image of it is a lesson. And Simon, verse 36, Simon and those who were with him followed him, and they found him. Simon and those who were with him, if that's the other 3 disciples, or maybe by this time, because the popularity of Jesus is growing and growing and growing, maybe it's more than the 4, right? As we know, the crowds gathered around Jesus as his ministry increased. But they go out, and it says they followed him. Now the Greek here, without getting into the Greek, the Greek here gives the sense of pursue, right? It's not just that they followed him. Really, it would be better to translate it. They pursued him. It's the same word used in the Greek version of the Old Testament to describe what Pharaoh did to the Hebrews. The Pharaoh pursued the Hebrews into the desert. This is the same word. The Simon Peter and those who were with him pursued Jesus. So there's a sense of where Jesus go. Maybe even hostility, or certainly not hostility really, but more like misunderstanding. We've got to get Jesus. Where's he gone off to? The contrast is Jesus is the solitary, the contemplative, the one who sought out quiet spiritual space, and the apostles and those with him are noisy seekers, right? That's what they're missing, right? They're not slowing down the way the master is. And so it says, and Simon and those who were with him followed him, pursued him, and they found him, and they said, everyone is searching for you, right? And again, you get the sense that the disciples are more fired up, or more sort of wound up, we should say, than the strong one, than Jesus. They've had a heck of a first day. Everybody's talking about them, wondering where he is, and they don't want to let the news cycle pass, right? So they go grab Jesus, they pursue him, and they say, everyone is searching for you. And again, that word searching, right? Seeking, searching. And again, if you were to find that word throughout the rest of Mark's gospel, those who seek Jesus, those who search Jesus, whenever you find this verb, it's often used to describe people who don't quite get what Jesus is doing. They don't quite understand Jesus. Sometimes this verb is associated with those who want to seek Jesus to do him harm, right? The Pharisees and the scribes sought Jesus to catch him out. The biological family of Jesus, as we'll see in chapter 3, seek him. They look for him, right? And then Jesus talks about his eschatological family, right? And so you get this image, of Simon pursuing Jesus. Everyone's searching for you, right? This sort of misunderstanding, this almost aggression, seeking out Christ, seeking out Jesus, while Jesus is the strong one and has done these mighty works and has spoken with authority. Yet he has this solitary reservoir, this depth, this foundation of prayer, which the disciples have yet to appreciate, right? And again, for any sort of Christian, Christian ministers like myself, anyone who works in the name of Christ or speaks in the name of Christ, this right here is a lesson, isn't it? Against becoming a busybody, it's a lesson against thinking that we can do Christian work without Christian prayer, right? Clearly we cannot, right? Our example is Jesus, who did an enormous amount of awesome and powerful stuff. But before the sun got up himself and went and sought out his Father in prayer. That's the lesson we mustn't miss, right? Even though, as it says, everyone is searching for you, right? Again, Mark is making this point again and again and again about the fame of Jesus in his ministry, how it's spreading and booming. And again, what's interesting is Jesus' answer in verse 38. And he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And again, he sort of, he goes in a direction you don't expect. The disciples, might have been thinking, "Boy, we've got a good start to the business here. Why not go back to Capernaum and capitalize, so to speak, on the good start that you had yesterday, right? Why not reap the benefits of your work and build But Jesus says, no, let's go to the next town in order to preach, right? What you see here, and again, this is just my take on it, what you see here, I think, is Jesus being faithful to his vision and his mission statement, to use corporate speak, right? Any institution thrives when that institution sticks to its vision, right? When it does what it can do. And that's what Jesus is simply doing here. As he said in the very beginning of the chapter, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe in the gospel. He was, as it says, preaching the gospel of God, right? That's what he came to do. The healings, the miracles, the wonders are not the primary mission, right? The primary mission is preaching the kingdom. And so he's faithful to that. He sticks to that. He says, that's why I came out, which is a funny way to say it. What John talks about, John uses the language of Jesus having come from God. And so it's similar to what Jesus says here, that's why I came out, which could be quite literally, why I left Capernaum, why I came out of Capernaum, so I could go preach. It could be that very mundane meaning. But in a broader sense, it could be, well, this is my mission, right? This is why I'm here, to preach the gospel of God to all these towns, not to, set up a shop and call it Jesus' healing ministry of Capernaum, right? And so again, that's a lesson for the Christian. It's a lesson for the Christian church, the Christian parish, the Christian institution, to stick to your vision, to stick to your mission, to stick to your vocation, what God has given you to do. If you're a preacher, preach. Don't sit there and try and turn yourself into something you are not, right? It's true for me, it's true for you, it's true for Jesus even, as we can see. And so verse 39 summarizes it all. Jesus goes through all of Galilee preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. He does what he has been doing all chapter 1, fulfilling verse 14. Verse 14, Jesus came into Galilee preaching the gospel of God. Here, verse 39, Mark tells us he's doing it and doing it well, right? It's all of Galilee now. It's spreading. Very interesting phrase there, however, you should notice in verse 39 where it says preaching in their synagogues. That's makes some scholars think that the writer of this gospel, maybe the first hearers of this gospel, would have been Gentile Christians who wouldn't have seen, who would have naturally said their synagogues because they weren't in synagogues. You know what I'm saying? It'd be an odd thing for, Peter, for example, or Andrew to say their synagogues because they're synagogues. There are synagogues. So again, that's, some would see that as like almost a slip of the tongue, showing that this isn't necessarily a Jewish Christian text. That's debatable. And it also reflects Jesus' early ministry preaching strategy of going to synagogues first. You see it in Acts of the Apostles as well. Paul would always preach in the synagogue first, and then he'd get kicked out, and then he'd go find some house to preach in. And so you see that similar strategy here. But then we move on to the next section, verses 40 through 45. It's an interesting passage because it sort of awkwardly fits in the text. You could, for example, take out verses 40 through 45 and skip from verse 39 to chapter 2, verse 1, and if no one told you we'd taken it out, you wouldn't even realize. This story is told in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8, and Luke's Gospel, chapter 5. And in those Gospels, the story is located differently in the narrative. In Matthew chapter 8, this healing miracle happens immediately after the Sermon on the Mount. And in Luke chapter 5, this story happens immediately after Jesus calls the first disciples, right? And so in each of the synoptic gospels, the story is planted in slightly different areas. And interestingly, whereas we know the Simon Peter's mother-in-law was healed in her house. We know the exorcism happened in the synagogue. In this particular healing miracle, there's no sort of time or place stamp, right? Certainly not a place stamp. It's just kind of out there. He's on the outskirts of Capernaum, out in the wilderness, outside Capernaum, and he happens upon this leper. So it gives you a sense of this story being, belonging to source material that each gospel writer put somewhere, right? And here Mark put it at the end of chapter 1. But all of that shouldn't bother you or freak you out. It didn't bother the early readers of this gospel, and so it shouldn't you either, because the story is so rich and amazing, or beautiful, really, and it teaches a lot, and you'll see these lessons repeated throughout the gospel of Mark. And it's very similar to healing miracles you'll see, especially in chapter 5 of Mark's gospel, as you will see. And again, it's a wonderful story to follow the verbs and to sort of chew on the verbs as they appear, and let the verbs of the text paint the picture for you, and it paints a very beautiful picture of Jesus and what he is doing. And it's, to get into the story itself, it's a story of Jesus healing a leper. Now, to talk about, before we dive in verse by verse, we should talk about leprosy. It's biblical leprosy itself. The Greek word leprosy comes from the Greek word, the Greek verb leptine, which means to peel off, which is quite gross, actually, to think about. Skin peeling off. And it's not necessarily what today we call leprosy, otherwise known as Hansen's disease. Leprosy in the biblical sense sort of refers to all sorts of skin diseases, which freaked the ancients out. Leprosy was often associated in the Old Testament with punishment for sin. Elisha, for example, had his assistant Gehazi, who took some money for a healing. All your televangelists should read that story. Took some money for healing, and Elisha said, well, for doing that, you're going to get leprosy too, right? So kind of a primitive story. But in the ancient mind, they often associated all sorts of illnesses with sin, and leprosy was no different than that. If you read chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Leviticus, two very long chapters, it describes how to regulate the disease of leprosy, how to certify its healing, and so on. The person suffering from leprosy had to dress a certain way, had to isolate from the community, had to, if saw anybody coming near them, had to yell out, unclean, unclean, and now, thinking of COVID-19, now we have apps for that, to enforce social distancing. But that's an aside. And also, for the leprous person, if the leprous person came into contact with a person who's not suffering from leprosy, that person would become unclean too, right? So there's a strong sort of fear and sense of contagion, even when things weren't contagious. And so, a person suffering from leprosy in the ancient world, especially in Jesus' day, would have been an outcast, would have been marginalized, would have looked differently, would have looked quite frightening, to be honest. He would have been he or she would have been a person that you would go away from, not toward, right? For the sake of ritual purity, for the sake of social cohesion and protection. There was a lot of fear and hostility associated with leprosy, which makes the story at the end of Mark chapter 1 so remarkable. So to dive into the text, verse 40, it says, "And a leper came to him, begging him and kneeling." All right? Again, the reason I say follow the verbs is because Mark stacks up the verbs in such a remarkable way. And by stacking up these verbs, he's just painting a really sort of vivid picture, right? So in verse 40, the leper comes to him, begs, and kneels, right? In Luke's gospel, he prostrates himself, right? And so just think that first verb, the leper came to him. The leper came to him. Remember how Mark said that Jesus' fame was spreading, all of Galilee had heard what the amazing things that Jesus had done. And so you think about this poor leper, the way Mark tells the story. You think about this poor leper who having read the headlines, having heard these stories about Jesus, musters up the courage. This leper is really an admirable guy. Musters up the courage to go to him, right? Here's this guy, this poor guy who's been suffering, who's been isolated, who's an outcast. It's like his last-ditch hope. I'm going to go to him, right? He's very, very similar to the woman later in the gospel that we'll see who suffered from the issue of blood for such a long time. And she says, if I can just go touch his garment, I can be healed, right? What you see in these healing miracles in Mark's Gospels, which is really beautiful, is the power and the beauty of their desperation, right? These are people who are at the end of their tether, and they just don't care anymore, and so they reach out no matter what, right? And so here's a leper who says, I'm done. I'm going to try, right? And so he comes to him. And then the next verb is begging. Parakalene is the word. And again, you're going to find this verb to beg or to plead again and again and again in healing miracles in Mark's gospel. Again, they're stacked up, especially in Mark chapter 5. And it's a feature, it's a verb which describes what the desperate do, right? And again, it's what makes these characters so beautiful. Is because they're so broken down. They're at rock bottom. They've suffered for so long that they just don't care what anybody thinks of them. They just don't care about propping up some sort of ridiculous propaganda of self-worth, right? Most of us care what we think about. We don't want to be seen to be begging to anybody, right? We have a sense of our own dignity and strength and so on and so forth. These people don't care about that. They've pushed that rubbish aside. Their pride is gone, right? And so that enables them to approach Jesus, right? They prostrate themselves. Or as it says, he kneels, And so what I'm saying is in these people who get healed by Jesus, who receive healing from Jesus, they show us how to approach Jesus in genuine faith. They've completely gotten rid of their sense of worth, right? I don't mean that in a negative way, right? They've gotten rid of their pride, right? And And that's what makes their approach to Jesus, their prayer to Jesus, so powerful and so beautiful, right? Is because they've given up all the rubbish and they're humble enough finally to beg, right? And that's what you see in the leper, and that's what we'll see in so many of these healing miracles in Mark's gospel as we go on, right? And so he says to him, if you will, you can make me clean, right? If you will, it literally means you have the power, right? So here's a person who's kneeling and who's begging, and he says, if you will, you have the power, right? That's exactly what it says in the Greek. And again, just think of Jesus is the strong one, right? Jesus is the strong one. Think of Isaiah 40. He is the mighty God who will yet shepherd his people, right? So this image of strength and compassion, which you find in Isaiah 40, is exemplified in this passage, right? If you will, you have the power, right? And so he comes to him, he begs, he kneels, he prays, and then verse 41. It says, moved with pity, he stretched out his hand, he touched him, and he said, right? Again, verbs stacked up, right? He's moved with pity. The Greek gives you a sense of he's like stirred in his guts, you know, deeply stirred in his guts or in his heart. You know how sometimes you when you see someone suffering, maybe someone in your family, maybe your kid or something, and it just kind of makes you physically nauseous, right? And a parent who sees his child in the hospital, his or her child in the hospital, right? That sort of, I might throw up sort of feeling that any good parent knows who's been in that situation, right? So the idea is, the sense that you get in the original language is that his compassion is not academic, but it's visceral, right? His compassion is full, right? It consumes not just his mind and his soul, but his body, right? He's stirred, he's moved with pity, and it's because of that he stretches out his hand and he touches it. Again, he's touching a leper, right? Leviticus 5. He's incurring the penalty of becoming unclean himself by touching. He's violating the taboo, right? And so the leper violated convention by, he was so desperate he forget, unclean, keeping the distance. He comes to Jesus, and Jesus honors that violation of convention by violating convention himself and by touching it, right? Again, this by itself, this image by itself, is full of wisdom and teaching for Christians, right? With respect to our fear and the conventions we create out of that fear, right? Jesus doesn't respect them. He didn't respect them in this situation. He doesn't respect them today, right? So he stretches out his hand, he touches him, and he speaks, and he says, I will be clean. And again, it's the power of his word. It's the authority and the dunamis, the power, exousia, authority, and dunamis, the power of his word that cleanses the man, right? And here we go again. And immediately in verse 42, right? There it is. We haven't seen it, this section yet. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. The miracle's instantaneous, right? Again, we're back to the sort of the speed of this gospel. But in verse 43, it says, and he sternly charged them and sent him away at once. And this is a very interesting verse that scholars have debated for a long, long time. Sternly charge him, in the sense of, it literally means like Jesus growled at him, right? And he sent him away. Same language that used to describe the casting out of demons, right? So you could translate this legitimately by saying, and he growled at him and cast him out, right? Almost like he's casting out a demon, which has suggested to some scholars that maybe this an earlier version of the story had exorcism with it too, who knows? But he says he sternly charged him, and he said to him, and sent him away at once. And again, the reason people think this verse 43 is sort of an interesting verse that may be residue of an earlier story is because even though it says he sent him away at once, the guy stays and he keeps talking, right? Because in verse 44 it says, and he said to him, see that you say nothing to no one, not a thing to nobody, it says, right? But go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to the people. That is, go back and fulfill the prescription that you find in Leviticus 13 and 14, which that is to undergo examinations by a priest, to offer sacrifices, and so on and so forth, to be certified as clean again, right? And so Jesus is, after violating ritual taboo, he respects it, and he tells them to go get certified as clean by the priests, and for proof to the people. Now, I've always thought, why go through that? Well, being unclean, being leprous, would have excluded you from the community, right? And so the poor guy is suffering from alienation and excommunication, basically, with this disease. When Jesus tells him to go get certified as clean, Jesus is very realistically saying, okay, go get certified as clean so therefore you can re-enter into the community, right? So that you can join society again. So Jesus is practically taking care of the guy, or pragmatically, giving him very good advice. We know you're clean, I know you're clean, but you need to go ahead and get certified as clean so therefore you can go back to work on Monday, basically. That's why Jesus tells him to go find a priest, right? Now, then we come to verse 45. It's a very interesting phrase. But then he went out and began to talk freely about it, right? So Jesus, you get the curious sort of thing here. In verse 44, Jesus says, don't say anything to anybody, right? But verse 45 says, but then he went out and began to talk freely about it and spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, right? So, here's this guy. Did he not hear? Did he just, flatly disobey Jesus? What's going on? There's a story like this in chapter 7, as we'll see, when Jesus hears heals a deaf man, and he tries and tells people to sort of keep it mum, but no one keeps it mum. They're just blabbing all over the place about it. Here's another instance of what we call the Messianic Secret, which we've talked about before. And there's a couple ways you can look at that. First, as some scholars, few scholars have suggested, on verse 45 it says, but he went out and began to talk freely. The he there, the subject of the sentence, some suggest, is not the former leper, but Jesus, right? And so if that's the case, then the leper probably kept mum, but Jesus talked about it, right? Which would save the leper from, being thought to be disobedient to the Lord. That Jesus didn't tell himself to be quiet. He just told that guy to be quiet. It's possible to read that, right? Especially in the second half of verse 45, it says, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter the town. In the Greek, it doesn't say Jesus, it says he, right? So strictly speaking, verse 45 doesn't identify who he is, right? Most scholars, however, do believe that the story is like the story you find in chapter 7, that it is the former leper, rather, who went out and just kept talking, right? Both are interesting ways to read it, and both satisfy in a certain sense, and also, doesn't really matter. I kind of like the conventional way of translating it. That's the former leper went out and just kept talking about it, because the story is chaotic to begin with, and it just kind of continues the chaos. There's a lot of violations of convention in this story. And so verse 45, if it's the former leper who kept running his mouth, keeps with the theme. But if it's Jesus, then Jesus can say what he wants. But anyway, so to step back and just look, because we've gone quite a long time this time, just to look at the story very simply, and again follow the verbs and meditate upon the text. You have a leper who's hit rock bottom, so rock bottom that he doesn't care anymore about what people think of him, and so therefore he's free to beg, and he's free to kneel and to grovel, basically, and that perfects his prayer, right? And that prayer is met with compassion, right? Moved with pity, visceral pity, within Jesus' very self, right? And so his humble prayer is met with compassion. And when Jesus' compassion and that humble prayer to come together, what happens is healing, right? And when he is healed, he is restored. He is restored to the worshiping community of Israel, because he gets to go to the priest and gets certified as clean, and he's brought back into the fold, and he becomes an evangelist, right? This story is a paradigm, really. It's an example of the Christian life as such. It's an example for a lot of the healing miracles we'll see down the road, and it is a story which should challenge Christians, especially good rule-following Christians like Catholics and like me, that sometimes things are messier than our sacramental handbook suggests they should be, right? And we've got to accept that. We've got to be cool with that, right? Because although we are bound to sacraments and to the rules, don't begin to think God is, right? That's what this story teaches. And so there we are. We'll move into chapter 2 next time, and I promise to keep it a little bit shorter. But I hope you're well, and keep reading. Bye.